Good evening, and welcome to this brand new semester here at the Robert H. Smith School of Business at the University of Maryland, College Park. I'm Rebecca Bellinger. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Global Business here at Maryland Smith, and I am very pleased to welcome you all to our first event of our annual Distinguished Speakers in International Business series. And this evening, we'll be looking at artificial intelligence and the supply chain. I'd like to give a very special welcome not only to our panelists, but also to you, the students who are here with us in the audience, and those of you who are joining us via live stream. Thanks everyone for being here this evening. I'd also like to give a thank you to Marina Agustidas and Santiago Luna for putting together this evening's event. Excuse me. Before we get started, I'd like to say a few things about the center itself. We are the hub of global learning here at the Smith School, and indeed, global activity. Our mission is threefold. First, to bring the Smith School to the world, and the world to the Smith School. Second, to provide opportunities for students, faculty, staff, alumni, the business community to gain global mindset and international business skills. And third, to serve as a resource in the state of Maryland for businesses seeking to be successful in the global marketplace. And we achieve this mission through student programming. Students, are any of you interested in studying abroad? A couple of you, international business treks, Passport to Global Mindset program, all of that runs out of the center. We also have faculty development programs. We work with businesses on capacity building and training programs. And we are the place where school internationalization and partnership building happens. We also are part of a thought leadership and research community. And this event here, our Distinguished Speakers Series, is part of our, and really our signature thought leadership event. We bring together policymakers, academics, thought leaders, industry representatives to explore and discuss hot topics, if you will, in international business, really to complement what we're doing, what we're teaching, and what we're learning in the classroom here at the school. The series is sponsored, hosted by the Center for Global Business, and funded in part by a Title VI grant known as SIBE that comes to us through the U.S. Department of Education. We hope that you will join us not just at this evening's event, but all of the events that we have throughout the year, including next month's highlight, which focuses on North American trade and the USMCA. And then in November, we'll be doing our annual panel on global competencies for the 21st century workplace. At this event and all of the other events, we encourage audience participation. Our panelists are prepared for the toughest questions that you have. So if you're here with us in the audience in College Park, we're going to ask you to recognize the two mics here. When it's time to ask questions, we'll ask you to stand at one of the mics, introduce yourself, and address the question to the panelist. If you are joining us via live stream, for the first time, you too can ask questions by tweeting us at @SmithGlobalBiz, and that's B-I-Z, or by sending an email to Santiago Luna at sluna@rhsmith.umd.edu. So please, everyone, be ready to ask questions. And now, finally, the main event. I would like to turn the evening over to our moderator, Suresh Acharya, one of our very own faculty members in DOIT. Please join me in welcoming our panel.
Thank you, Rebecca. I just want to echo what Rebecca just said and really extend a warm welcome to our distinguished guests, of course, students, faculty, the extended Maryland family. I know it's a Thursday evening and you've chosen to be here, so thank you very much. Before we start, I also want to express my gratitude to Professor Kislaya Prasad, who asked me to moderate this. Certainly looking forward to it. So what I want to do first is I'll just quickly introduce our distinguished guests, just the name and their current titles, and then we'll have them introduce themselves, tell us a little bit more about who they are, what they do, but also their journey, if you will. So to my immediate left, Imaid El Junaidi, who serves as Chief Procurement Officer at Tronox. After him, John Miller, who serves as Vice President of ITIC, that's Information Technology Industry Council. And then to my far left then, Suketu Gandhi, who is partner at A.T. Kearney, focusing on the digital supply chain. So again, welcome, and you made from your, if you could introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more.
Thank you, Suresh. Imad Al-Junaidi, Chief Procurement Officer for a company called Tronox. Tronox is a titanium mining and manufacturing company. We operate in 6 different continents around the globe. The only continent we don't operate in is Antarctica, but we plan to find a mine there and operate. Before that, I worked for GE for about 10 years, also in supply chain and operations, and I worked for Chrysler before that. Very, very happy to be part of this and looking forward to the event.
And you're also a fellow Terrapin.
I am. So I appreciate it. So I actually I was part of the executive MBA program, cohort 13, and this used to be our dining hall, and the classroom was just down the hall there. So I'm very familiar with campus and this place. Before that, I did a master's at Syracuse University in manufacturing engineering, and I'm a mechanical engineer undergrad.
John.
Thank you, and thank you to the Smith School and students for joining us here this evening. My name is John Miller. I am Vice President and Senior Counsel, Vice President of Policy and Senior Counsel at ITI, the Information Technology Industry Council. We are based in Washington, D.C., as well as Brussels, and we are a trade association representing major, large technology, multinational companies. Companies doing really from across the tech sector, hardware, software, internet companies, other tech-enabled companies, and services and cybersecurity and a host of other types of companies. I lead our trust, data, and technology policy practice, so dealing with issues ranging from cybersecurity and supply chain, to privacy and data protection, to artificial intelligence and other data innovation and policy issues. I also do quite a bit of work with the public-private partnership mechanisms in Washington, D.C., including chairing the IT Sector Coordinating Council, which is comprised of over 100 IT organizations, and co-chairing the ICT Supply Chain Risk Management Task Force, along with the communications sector and the Department of Homeland Security. In terms of my journey, prior to ITI, I worked for nearly a decade for Intel Corporation, one of the ITI members, and prior to that was a lawyer in private practice in New York, working on business litigation primarily, and intellectual property litigation. So it's true what they say, you can do many things besides be a lawyer with a law degree. So.
That's great. Thanks, John. Suketu.
Suketu Gandhi. I'm a partner with A.T. Kearney. I lead our product area of global digital supply chain. I started my career at a small retailer in Bentonville, Arkansas. Hopefully some of you guys know it. And it truly learned what supply chain meant, but I didn't understand at that point. And along the way, have picked up some technical skills that kind of brings it all together now. And it's a wonderful place to be, and in a wonderful area that is growing rapidly. And just this thing around the title, right? The global and AI and supply chain, it's because, there's a lack of global intelligence, so we have to use artificial intelligence to make up and make the supply chain work better. That's a joke.
Great. Thanks. So what I want to do is, before I jump right into the questions, some of you are probably wondering, AI, global supply chain, what is this all about? And so what I thought we would do is hear from our distinguished guests, our panelists, about what they view AI and the global supply chain is, so that we know what we're going to be discussing. So without any particular order, if anyone wants to define, if you will, what we mean by AI in the global supply chain.
Sure. I mean, I think in terms of, well, I'll take them separately anyway. At least start with AI. I think AI gets thrown around a lot in policy discussions in the media and elsewhere, and a lot of times there isn't necessarily definitional clarity as to what we're actually talking about. I don't think we're quite to the Terminator, Rise of the Machines species of AI that you see in the movies. It's actually, I think it's really instructive to break it down into its component parts. To me, and frankly, a lot of the work that I'm doing these days, data is at the center of everything, and I think that's certainly true in the case of artificial intelligence. A lot of the focus is often on the algorithms and the software, and I don't want to minimize the importance of algorithms and software to AI, but if you don't have large, diverse, and valid data sets to train those algorithms with, and data to process, your algorithms aren't going to do much for you, whether it's a supply chain application or anything else. There's also some differences between, I think probably fairly stated, the types of AI that we see in use today are really probably more fairly characterized as narrow AI focused on a specific task rather than some type of broader AI, and also there's a lot of machine learning today, which I think is really important to distinguish too. So I don't know if others have anything to add in on the AI front.
You definitely, all these components, when you speak AI, people immediately think a robot or a computer. In reality, is all about data, is all about the algorithms that define the data and handle the data together, but also the computing power that would allow you to respond and give you that intelligence that you need almost instantaneously. And that has been progressing exponentially over the past decade or so.
Maybe one way to also think about it is that the dean corrected me. She said the supply chains have been around for a long period of time. They've always been there. But they've been fairly simple. And the end consumers of the supply chain have had very predictable behavior because we were primarily supply constrained. Now, as demand exploded and the complexity of the product exploded, it has become increasingly difficult to manage that. And as we truly made our supply chains global, initially it was fairly straightforward to control it and manage it. And now it's impossible to control it using just human intelligence. And that's where artificial intelligence comes into play. So, on the one side, you've had supply chains and products getting more and more complex, become difficult to manage, and then technology has progressed far enough to come together with AI, and that's where the intersection brings out a wonderful and a powerful mechanism to bring more ideas, more products, more services, more complexity, but manage it in a very simple way. One last thing I'd like to say is there's all the conversation about singularity and things of that nature. Human intelligence is still very valuable, even in supply chain. So please go to school, learn about supply chain, and you'll have a wonderful job.
Great, thanks. I just want to build on what each of you touched upon, and specifically to you, when it comes to this discussion around AI, we tend to think about the infinite compute power that we seem to have, the proliferation of data, the advances that we've made in algorithms, for example. But how has that really come together in the space that we know, which is the space of supply chain and logistics? What do you see in your organization, and what do you see across the industry?
Thank you, Suresh. How many? Maybe I can sense the room. How many are supply chain majors here? Okay, that's good. So not most of the room. So maybe it's important to actually define what supply chain is, or what's in scope. It's really the entire value in any business, the entire value chain from procuring the materials and the services to in bringing that material and services into warehousing, than in a traditional manufacturing, as well as distribution and the customer service. So the entire everything could be referred to. So if some company could call just the early part supply chain. Some businesses could call the entire value chain a supply chain. So wherever we go, it is really what facilitates the product, the services, from the point that the sale has happened to actually bring it to the consumer, whatever that is called supply chain. So I hope everybody has that same definition. But to build on the point that you raised, AI, defined the way we defined it, actually can touch every single component of this and deliver value. So in recent years, and I'll talk about the industry I'm in and other industries, productivity and cost is probably one of the major drivers of adaptation and implementation. Just the amount of data and the computer, the power of computing. If you take just the warehousing activity, for example, and the efficiency and the productivity in there, larger companies now have very minimal human interaction within their warehousing, from receiving to stocking to issuing and distribution. But also, one of the recent breakthroughs, technology like the one you see at the airports, scanning the products and all that stuff, inspection, that was usually a bottleneck, an area of cost because of defects and all that stuff when it gets to the consumer. Now with the power of AI, and how fast you process this, you can detect the products very, very quickly when they come in, when they leave. So that cost is completely gone when you adapt something like this. Another area of supply chain is demand and business planning. Major companies and businesses can get an instantaneous feedback about how their demand for their product is. They can, with the AI, even some sophisticated businesses can automate this, adjust their business plan and their manufacturing processes and their schedule, and then even stop ordering of raw material or increase ordering raw materials to deliver the product to the customer. So multiple. These are just two areas of many. Another area is customer service. A lot of us deal with that on a day-to-day basis. When you call or when you go to a customer service website and you're dealing with the chat bot or automated service, there's a lot of intelligence that built into that. Slowly but surely you have less and less human interaction, and customer service is very fully automated these days.
John and Sukhinder, if you wanted to add anything to that in terms of what you see out there.
Yeah, sure. I being the policy guy on the panel, I see it just a little bit higher level sometimes, but I think, again, breaking it down, and viewing it through the lens of innovation, we're as well as data, we're talking about technological innovations, in the fields of transportation and communication for sure in the supply chain context. And really, just to slightly restate what my fellow panelists said, companies are now able to operate on 6 or 7 continents for whoever's doing business in Antarctica, and maintain constant virtual communication with not only their employees, but their warehouses, their suppliers, their production facilities, and further, if you look at some of the other innovations that would seem to me anyway to be particularly relevant in the in the supply chain context, I think one example would be GPS technology, for instance, and just using software to manage fleets or various other parts of the supply chain, whether we're talking about factories or using just other types of tracking technology with respect to inventory management and things like that.
The role of data in supply chain is about making better decisions. That's the simple truth. And why do these decisions require artificial intelligence or anything of that sort? If you go to an average store, your bookstore here, you probably have 10,000 items. You go to a slightly larger store, 50,000. You go to a larger grocery store with the other goods, you have somewhere between 150,000 items. You go to your favorite online places, there are millions of items and there is no limitation to that. So how do I decide what do I store, what do I buy, where do I keep it so I can deliver it to you next day or within the next few hours? All of these are what I would call decision domains, and they're based on data. Now, as the complexity and the size of the data increases, the set of tools we use to make these decisions get more and more advanced. But that's, data is the, all kinds of stuff. People say data is the oil, data is like dirt, but you don't go from, brown to green, that's money, without a lot of processing in between and better decisions. But it's all about making better decisions. And that's what data is wonderful for. And that's where all the technology and the conversations around, the plan, make, source, deliver come into play.
Excellent, thank you. What there are a few follow-ups that I certainly want to do, but coming a little bit closer to what we want to talk about. So how is AI then enabling things like cross-border trade? How is it helping bring together potentially intricate, possibly intelligent supply chains, making it more reliable, if you will? So if you could shed some light on that, any of you.
Well, I mean, from the global trade standpoint, there really is no trade in the modern society without the ability to move data and to move data digitally. So if we consider that really, what artificial intelligence is going to be able to do, whether it's in the supply chain context or in any other context, is allow us to move data more efficiently and potentially quickly. It's going to be very important and arguably is going to help increase global trade. I think we might get into some potential policy measures that are out there that actually stand to potentially kind of put the brakes on some of our ability to move data in the global context. And I guess I'll hold those comments until then, but that's just the way that I would start the answer to that question.
Yeah, I'll use actually a specific example in own experience. We're exploring upgrading ERP's system into the cloud, into the new universe. One of the advantages from a global trade perspective is, traditional companies got their own servers, their own data, they manage it, they're protected, and they operate their business accordingly. But when you go to the cloud and you have also access to common data, such as regulations or customs or data like this, and that gets implemented across different businesses, ERP, you're able to respond and run, re-optimize your business and make decisions according to that. It would have made sense to serve customer A from your facility in Europe. Now with the change of this regulation, now you may want to do it from from China or from India or from the Middle East or wherever your other. So you're able to react, respond, and if you automate the decision making in your behalf, you're able to keep your business at the optimal level.
And you see some of that happening.
It is happening. Those solutions are out there, and that's the power of actually the commonality of the data rather than the traditionally ERP system sitting on the business and protected by the businesses. The balance between having your own data but having access to the rest of the world at the same time.
Thank you. So, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think
you're good with that. John, I wanted to follow up and tap into your expertise around policies, right? So, when we think about AI and supply chain, a lot of that conjures up images of what companies are doing. But what are governments doing in terms of policy, in terms of these proposals to facilitate, leverage the power? What are the opportunities? And of course, are there any risks?
Thank you. Well, we were just chatting a little bit before the panel began about how AI and supply chain are two of the hotter policy issues right now, particularly technology policy issues. And on the positive side, governments are, I think, recognizing the power of artificial intelligence, in particular, as a real differentiator and a force multiplier. That's going to be important for their societies and their economies. And you've got, a host of proposals, including here in the U.S. There was a recent, White House AI strategy that was put forward, including an executive order as well. And you've got, the Department of Commerce and the National Institute of Standards and Technology actually putting out some, a strategy for international standards development and artificial intelligence. You've got R&D money being pledged, not only in the U.S. but in Europe and in China, and really governments are really focused on trying to really get a competitive advantage over each other, which is potentially good from a business standpoint. But, particularly if these are not unfunded mandates,
Yeah.
but we actually see, dollars going into research. But by the same token, there are some concerns from a policy standpoint with the technologies. With AI technology, it can range from everything from privacy-related concerns, particularly when we start talking about decisions being made and data being transferred with potentially removing the human element, whether there are going to be, whether we're going to be able to adequately protect that data, and particularly personal information. Beyond regulating personal information, you've also got a variety of policy proposals, including in Europe. There's something called the e-privacy regulation, which is seeking to regulate non-personal data. And there was actually just a proposal coming out of India within the past week or so to do the same thing. And it particularly raises issues in a context such as supply chain, because you're talking about metadata and data that's just usually kind of back-end data that doesn't necessarily implicate fundamental human rights such as privacy or anything else. And if you're going to have policy proposals that aren't necessarily tailored to that, you could potentially undermine the ability to move that data across borders. And then on the supply chain front, there are some very valid concerns regarding potential national security implications of supply chain right now. And there are a lot of discussions going on in the context of the 5G network build-out, for instance, about trustworthy communications networking equipment and non-trustworthy communications equipment. And there's a whole host of policy proposals that again have the ability to potentially undermine the ability to transfer data or technology, ranging everything from supply chain regulation and legislation to export controls to investment restrictions, et cetera. And again, at the end of the day, we want to make sure that these policy proposals are carefully tailored to addressing the risks, whether they're national security risks and privacy risks, without undermining the great potential of using these technologies to do all the things that the governments want to do in the first place, including in the supply chain context.
Excellent.
Maybe a slightly different view, which is governments cannot control data unless you are...
They're definitely trying.
Yeah, they're trying, that's right, unless you're part of the hermit kingdom or something like that. They try, right? You got to turn off the internet to turn off data. And it's the troika of the government and businesses and individuals that really can bring a difference, right? They make a huge difference. So Let's take the example of GDPR.
Mm-hmm.
It started out because a young kid in Austria didn't like the fact that data was being published. At least that started the spark. That led to quite a comprehensive legislation that comes into play. So you as individual consumers do have a lot of power in this data discussion. And you're speaking up, right? Talk about Greta, who has kind of changed how we think about global warming. The same way, this is one of these days going to explode in a way which is going to cause people to really think about it. The businesses care about it because you will not buy their product. There's plenty of examples in the beauty space, in the fashion space, where somebody's picture was used improperly that leads to a backlash that dramatically changes consumer behavior. So when we think about data, it is the three sides coming together. Government is important, but the consumer and the companies coming together, that's where the power lives. And then the last thing is there will be two sets of companies. One that will openly tell you that we won't use your data and it will live on your device and almost promise you. And then there's others who won't say a thing. And you as consumers will make a choice. And that data in the supply chain world is absolute gold because it tells me what I should make, what do you like, what you don't like, when should it arrive at your door, and what's the price you're willing to pay for it. So we should not underestimate the power of the individual in making this dramatically different, especially in the supply chain world.
Absolutely agree with that. Just to comment briefly, certainly companies are partnering with governments and trying to work with governments, and in particular to lend their technical expertise to governments. And I think governments, many government policymakers, to their credit, recognize that they don't necessarily, have the same capacity for hiring engineers as companies, and I think are increasingly working together. And your point's well taken about the power of even one consumer. In the case of, I think you're referring to Max Schrems, and in fact, something called the Safe Harbor Agreement between the U.S. and the EU was actually invalidated because of Max Schrems' lawsuit, and it gave rise to something ultimately called the Privacy Shield Agreement. But the bottom line is there was actually a period of several months where the ability of companies to transfer data from Europe to the United States was in jeopardy in many ways. And again, that's why data is really so important here. And I think for consumers and for companies and for governments, that's why really trying to figure out how to build trust in this global digital ecosystem and economy is really so important.
Matt, anything you want to add to that?
When it comes to policy, it is. I think the predicament would be making it an enablement as opposed to a hinderness to hinder the progress of supply chain and globalization. The phenomena that has been happening, of course, in recent years. There are societies that are trying to regulate and over-regulate, and then there are societies that don't want to regulate. And I think that clash, between Europe, the U.S. and the likes, and then maybe China and the Far East, the different view how that happens would have a significant impact on progress and how global trade will actually happen between those countries.
It could be potentially be disruptive in that sense.
Absolutely, and you could start dividing the world into different segments, basically. Yeah.
And in particular, it's in the global context. It's not just domestic privacy laws that we're talking about, but restrictions on transferring data across borders, which is really the key, I think, in so many ways.
Right.
And there are no borders in data, so this is the predicament, really.
Right. There are many topics we could certainly talk about, security being one of them, but I did want to touch upon something that I'm sure is important to all of us. When it comes to AI, we talk about the great compute power, we talk about algorithms, we talk about data, but at the end of the day, it's human beings that kind of impacts us. right? I was told that babies born after 2016 will not need a driver's license when they grow up. How about that? Right. So, Sukita, I wanted to tap into your expertise. You've talked about this. How does AI, especially as it applies to the supply chain, impacting us humans? What are the positives? What are the negatives? What are the apprehensions? And what are the opportunities?
So one of the most interesting, or maybe a little bit misunderstood thing about AI is, it's written by human beings and it's affected dramatically by data. So all your biases are in your code, whether you like it, you know it, or not. And unfortunately, you cannot look at code and say what the outcome will be. It depends on the data set going in. So there's plenty of examples of the ability of an algorithm to recognize one type of human being versus another because the data set did not have that built in. And that inherent bias is incredibly scary because you can only detect it after it has processed something and come up with an outcome. So as we think about in the supply chain, and that's why we firmly believe that until AI reaches a point where we can be confident of its analysis and outcome, human beings have to have their hand on the rudder so that biases that were built in the code or some biases in the training set of the data do not affect people. So that's kind of one big challenge to think through. And one of the things there's been a lot of conversations is that should there be a AI council that regulates that. It's very hard to do, but there are, I don't know the work here happening at Maryland, but there's a couple of other universities on the in Boston that are really focused on them, and we tend to work with them to understand that how do you identify the bias. So that's one big thing. The second thing is it is becoming a board level issue for companies because now your decisions are being moved from the hands of people to algorithms, and if an algorithm mistreats a customer, is the board responsible? The simple answer today is yes. And then, do you want to be on the board of a company that does that? So then there's going to be some kind of regulation around that. And then the last thing is this whole debate of who owns the data. And at the end of the day, it could, there's, again, companies will say consumer owns the data, and then you say who owns the algorithm that goes with that. So one classic book that's out there is called Weapons of Math Destruction, which is wonderful in illustrating what this can do to how data and AI can combine. And the last thing I'd say is 10 years ago, Mark Anderson wrote a great piece called Software is Eating the World. Now, software eating the world is on two components, is built on two things. One is data, and the second is AI. When those two come together, and about a week ago, Musk had this thingy going on in China where he said humans are the actual original bootloader for the technical guys in the room for AI engines, which is a fascinating comment that we're just some small piece of software to get a technology started, which is an interesting way to look at it. But that's what I think.
Thanks. John, anything you want to add on the human side of this?
I think one thing that's worth mentioning from the human perspective, particularly with respect to AI, is that there is still not necessarily widespread understanding of AI, and there is significant fear about is AI coming and taking my job and displacing jobs. So there's a lot of focus right now from a policy perspective on workforce development, workforce training, and reskilling of employees for this new world. Even though AI may displace some jobs, it's going to create other new jobs, and it's going to create a greater need for higher educated, more highly skilled workers to work in that capacity. That's just something that, and really one of the best ways to do that. And again, whether it's telling a kind of a good news story about how it's being used to help it in the supply chain context or in many other applications, helping to demystify the technology and explain it, and to explain positive use cases of how we can use AI or other technologies to help enable global business is something that I know that our members are very focused on.
Well, I mean, technology has been advancing for decades and centuries. And if you rewind 50 years ago and look at what jobs humans, or people used to do to what jobs they're doing today, and they're different. Technology has taken over. We had the same rhetoric when we automated the assembly lines in the auto industry. But it's the same. You started your question, driver's license, what? You said 2026?
So the baby's born after 2016.
2016. So it's this is coming. I mean, the drones and driverless trucks and cars that's coming. So those jobs will deliveries by even the mail person. Those will be displaced. So but then skills need to go elsewhere. AI means artificial intelligence, and intelligence is actually built by humans and will continue to be built by human, at least in our lifetime, and the skill set and the development needs to go there.
Thank you. I could go on asking my list of questions, but I do want to open it up to the students and the members of the audience. If you could grab one of the two mics, first of all, of course, introduce yourself and then ask your question, please. Thank you. And then I know we might have some online as well that Santiago's monitoring. So,
first of all, good afternoon, gentlemen. Thank you for your time. My name is Adam Gard. I am an MBA student here. Recently, master's degree graduated from MIT in supply chain management. And my biggest question is, you all have been talking about data this entire time, but do you foresee a future in which data is captured as a non-cash asset on the balance sheet? Thank you.
So that's the realm of accountants. But here's an interesting statistic, which is the value of data in companies is somewhere between 80 to $200 billion. So one of the conversations we tend to have is, and it's been utilized for extremely minimal payoff, extremely small payoffs. So the question we tend to start with, if you had 80 billion worth of assets in your firm and they were not being used, what would you do? So that's a wonderful question to ask a CEO on a board, and you get a dramatically interesting response. So you are correct that accountants are working through on how to capture that, but the inherent value will never be truly understood and calculated just looking at the base value of data, because there's the base value, there's the implied one, there's the third level calculations that come out of that, which are so dramatic. John used the example of GPS, right? GPS was a free technology invented by the government to track, let's just say something. It's in the open space, but it was there for the right reason. That technology alone, actually, we ran some numbers, is probably worth $3.5 trillion. And I know I'm wrong. Why? Because that has structurally changed how all of us are behaving. So tracking data is hard, right? But it is, your question is very valid and an incredibly powerful one to think through as people look at companies.
In short, it needs to be addressed. Very good question. Very good question. The question, will there be a balance sheet in the future? But that's a different question.
Good.
Hi, my name is Karishma Parikh, and I am senior in international business. So my question is that we are currently discussing on digital divide and islandization, and you talked about how data is shared and cannot be controlled by government. But since there is like a forecast going on digital divide and like separating economies and separating virtually and digitally, how will you then incorporate all your AI or information sharing in different countries? How will you work your supply chain in those different countries? Like, if your product does not get to customer, then it's like meaningless after crossing the borders. So that's my question. Thank you.
Policy
John,
thing.
yeah.
Yeah.
Who wants to take that?
Well, I mean, I think, I mean, it's. I'm trying to think of the best way to answer that. I mean, I think that you mentioned the digital divide. I mean, something that I mean, I do want to say I don't think I said that governments can't control data. One of my fellow panelists might have, but I will say this about it. Governments are. I think your question raises the following point. Governments are looking at ways, are actually looking at even their own very large, in many instances, caches of data and trying to figure out how to unlock the value of that data. For instance, public data sets here in the U.S. At various different agencies. I mean, the agencies are sitting on huge troves of data that, in many ways they'd like to make available for commercial use, or to bring more value, economically, and also to bring more value, in terms of socio-economic benefits for their citizens. And there's a lot of, different challenges that still need to be figured out in terms of, in particular, combining those data sets with other pre-existing data sets. You've got issues involving standards, et cetera. I mean, there is obviously a commercial element to data. I mean, to the larger question of who owns data, I don't think is necessarily always easily answered. It's somewhat relevant to the question previously about the value of data from an accounting standpoint. Certainly not going to offer any accounting insights, because I don't know that I have any for sure. But just the concept of data as a market asset is being looked at by policymakers in Europe and elsewhere. In the context of competition. I don't think it's. I mean, it's not the case that all data is shared by everyone, but really figuring out how to maximize the value of the data that's out there. And in some instances, companies are working together to pool that data. For instance, one example that just pops to mind is in the cybersecurity context. Pooling data together so that you all get, it's kind of one plus one equals more than two in that regard, because you're sharing the data. There are also things that are sometimes creating test beds or data sandboxes even to really try to figure out different ways to use data. These are all ideas with merit, and I think they're all being focused on right now to figure out how to again unlock the most value of the data for the most people, I think.
So I want to build on that question, because in the day and age of trade wars, and we're kind of thinking, are we going to have the U.S. bloc and the European bloc and maybe the Asian bloc? One of the things I think we forget is that there's a generational change that's happening as well. A good number of folks in this audience are of a generation where they feel comfortable sharing information. And that then perhaps gives us some optimism that while we're in this, who owns the data, let me protect mine, and we have all these rules. Do you see hope that perhaps we'll have more efficient supply chains because a more sharing generation will move up the ranks?
The simple answer is yes, right? The more data you have, you can make better decisions, back to the same thing. And the more intelligence we built into it, the supply chains are going to get significantly more efficient. At some point, you do reach the point of diminishing utility. So if I get to a statistically significant sample, And I can use that word here without any fear of people not understanding. But I think that's where it starts to kind of reach a point where diminishing utility, right? If I know about 1 million people in a segment, 1,010,000 ain't going to change my insight. But that's the thing. That's where you start to kind of really work through the data to understand at what point, you know, it's valuable versus not, and what should be shared versus not. So we are learning. Let's just say that. I think we are learning, understanding, and playing with this incredibly large amount of data sets that we have.
Well, first of all, I want to thank all of you. And I have so many questions. I'm trying to pick which one I should ask you. But maybe I'll go with this one. That for those people in the audience who are thinking of careers that in supply chain, what do they need to learn about AI before getting there? One thing I'm taking away from you is that you need to understand data issues and the strategic importance of data for companies, or where that's going to come from. But could you sort of elaborate on that more, on what they need to know as managers? And I don't know that there are many computer scientists here, but what they need to know as managers about AI in making career choices.
In the generation today, everybody is a computer scientist. There is nobody here who cannot be trained on how to use large quantities of data. And you know, whether you look at some of the simpler languages out there, Python and things of that nature, they're fairly simple. So everybody here is prepared for it. And here's an interesting carrot. A phenomenal AI supply chain person can easily take home 1.2 million bucks. So there's a little bit of value in doing that. It is harder to understand how the supply chain works. That's the harder part. And how do I tie the data I have with the flow, as you know, you talked about the flow of the information and the flow of the chain, and how do you make decisions? So those are kind of things that matter more. So this was about 8 years ago. A CFO of a very large, wonderful global company said, hey, my people don't know how to use this data in supply chain. I said, that's wonderful. What do you people do every day? Well, they make decisions about where to send their kids in college, what mortgage to take, how to travel from place A to place B, how to find the best ticket, right, flight ticket, and what do? They go to. He said, okay, if they can make those decisions outside, why do they come here and do you perform a frontal lobotomy that stops them from making decisions, right? So I think that's how we got to think about it, that you understand supply chain as a business, you understand what data is needed to make decisions, and then you deal with kind of the larger context of the massive size of data and what tools do I use. But we tend to call it mindset, skill set, and tool set. You bring those three things together, and it becomes fairly straightforward.
Yeah, I mean, the speed of change, we think it's fast now. It's going to be exponentially faster. And you know, for the future supply chain professionals, you just got to stay up to the technology and be able to adapt it, because it's going to be part of doing business. So that's maybe an advice I would have.
Yeah, and just to build on that a little bit, you know, I referenced that, you know, the 5G network build out is coming, and you know, that's another one of those terms that gets thrown around a lot, and maybe people don't know exactly what you know, 5G, fifth generation wireless networks are really all about and what they're going to enable. And again, in terms of data, you know, 5G is something along the lines of, you know, potentially 200 times. We're talking about 200 times more. You know, a multiple of data flowing through those networks. You know, we're talking about 20 times, you know, faster throughput speeds, et cetera. You know, so, I mean, it's true. We in some ways, we haven't seen anything yet in terms of, you know, how that networking, you know, speed and capacity itself is going to just further enable the even quicker development of AI, again, across a whole range of applications. And it is going to change things. So, again, I don't know what kind of classes they have in the business schools these days regarding data, but I think understanding data or studying that, I think, is going to be really key to AI and a bunch of other things in the future. Good. I see.
Not enough.
Excellent.
See, we didn't have any classes on data when I was in school. Anyway.
Before we go to you, I just wanted to ask you, Santiago, please.
Yes, I have a question from one of our remote participants. Thank you for sending it. Can you talk more about potential workforce displacement because of AI? Do you foresee the government needing to create incentivized retraining programs like those that are meant to retrain those displaced because of global trade?
I mean, governments are studying this issue right now. I actually, I think it was just last week, the White House held an artificial intelligence in government summit to talk about these issues, and that was one of the opening discussions was talking about the various different plans that are underway at the government now, around retraining and reskilling workers, and again, the business community has a very large part to play in that conversation as well. Several companies have essentially stood up and pledged to create, I forget what the number is, but a number of different jobs to try to balance things out, so to speak. But yeah, I mean, it's probably much too early to say with any certainty what type of or what numbers there might be in terms of displacement. But I think that working together, I think governments and industry are hopeful that we can counteract that by creating new jobs.
There's going to be a natural need, and the businesses will be forced to actually, do developments and training because they're going to need those skill sets that don't exist. So it's going to be a combination of policy and the business need.
Good evening, gentlemen. Thank you for coming. I'm Deng Tai Sen. I'm an undergraduate from American University. My question is, first off, let's talk about AI. AI is very easy to understand in technologically advanced countries like America, but back in the scope it says global supply chain. For countries like this, we have a high demand for coffee, right? What about not so technologically advanced countries like Uganda? They have a very good they have good demand over coffee beans, but how will you implement this type of AI into such not technology advanced countries, and how will you account the labor force that's relying on these businesses, and how will you account the law that is in different countries since it's a global supply chain?
Look at how fast iPhones have been adopted, and replicate that. You'll see that because there is a need. Societies will adapt. Some would be much slower than others, but to a certain extent, everybody is in the AI world just by using a simple device like the iPhone.
Yeah, I want to chime in with what Imad just said. So I think that while a digital divide will exist, I'm also optimistic. For those of you in the room, I have gone through this phone, to this phone, to that phone, and the last time I was in my home country of Nepal, I noticed that the orange vendor was using a smartphone. She bypassed all of those things that I went through. So technology is advancing, and yes, will there be a time when there will be the haves and the have-nots? I think the answer is yes. But I'm optimistic that we can get there, that if anything, technology is going to be the equalizer.
Thank you.
Yeah, and actually, just to add one other thing to that, I mean, if you look at just statistics such as per capita internet penetration, I mean it's 90%, upwards of 90% in places like Europe and I think probably the United States at this point, and below 50% in on the African continent and elsewhere, and it's one of the reasons why kind of prioritizing the kind of broadband digital infrastructure build out in those countries is such a priority and a way to actually shrink the divide. governments again, the United States, for example, and companies are very focused on that and how to actually, again, bridge that gap. And so I do think that over time that divide should shrink.
We can take one last question. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Aubin, and I'm a freshman here in the business school. So my question is, like, how will the introduction of AI into the global supply chain, how will that affect barriers of entry for certain companies? Will it cause the barriers of entry to be higher for like companies that want to enter the global market but can't, maybe can't afford them or don't have access to this technology? Or will it make it lower and make it easier for people to enter the global market?
Yeah, definitely will be a differentiator and will increase the barrier to entry. So if you're a new entrant in the supply chain world and you're not up to where it needs to be to from a technology and AI adaptation, you probably won't be able to get off the launching pad. So yes, it is going to be a differentiator. It is already a differentiator.
Okay. Anything else you want to add?
No, I think that covers it. Sure.
I'm looking at Marina. She's given me the hand wave that we have our time is up. I want to ask all of us to give a very warm round of applause one more time. We do have gifts for our distinguished guests. So Ritu, if I can ask you to come here and hand the gifts, and I'm assuming you'll be around for a bit to interact with our students as well. So this is for Imad.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I'm sure this is for John. Yes.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.